Hi everyone, and welcome back to Life Skills Unfiltered, the podcast where we get real about what it takes to help children and young people with learning difficulties to thrive in everyday life. I'm your host, Jo Iafrey, and today we're diving into something that affects everything from behaviour and learning to emotional well-being, but doesn't get talked about nearly enough: sleep. If you're a parent who's tried everything to get your child to sleep through the night, or a teacher wondering why a pupil is always exhausted and struggling to concentrate, this episode is for you. We're joined by Miriam, a sleep coach and researcher, who's here to help us unpack why sleep problems are so common in children with learning difficulties, particularly those with Down syndrome, and crucially, what we can actually do about it. So, grab a cup of tea, or maybe just sit somewhere quiet for a moment if you're running on empty yourself, and let's get into it. So, welcome along to Life Skills Unfiltered. I'm really pleased to be welcoming Miriam Shabetai along with us today. She's a sleep coach and a researcher looking into sleep and neurodevelopmental conditions. So, welcome along, Miriam. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Yes, hi, thank you for having me. So I'm currently a first year PhD student studying at Aston University in Birmingham, and my whole PhD is looking at sleep in teenagers with mild and moderate intellectual disabilities. But over the last 5 years, I've been kind of researching sleep in neurodevelopmental conditions and rare genetic syndromes. I've worked for charities looking at sleep. I've been a support worker with a couple of men who were in kind of supported accommodation, and they really struggled with sleep. So it's kind of been 5 years of like interest brewing about sleep that's kind of culminated with this like PhD now. But you mentioned that I'm also a sleep coach, and I work for a charity called Advance, based in Hertfordshire, that looks at kind of supporting caregivers, parents, and professionals working with children, predominantly with kind of ADHD and who are autistic. And I'm the like sleep coach there. So I do like one-on-one sessions with caregivers to support the sleep of their young child and young person. So yeah, I kind of eat, sleep, dream, sleep. There's a lot going on. When in doubt, I'm thinking about sleep.
And yeah, brilliant. And certainly in our house, that's also a thing. I'm very keen on my sleep as it is, but actually, I'm also mum to a 16-year-old with Down syndrome who has sleep apnea and is a BiPAP user, which we'll go into a little bit more overnight. So we, as a family, have a lot of experience around sleep, and actually have had a very challenging journey to get to the point where our daughter was properly assessed and treated for her sleep condition, which had a huge impact on us growing, with her growing up, but also now, sleep is actually a very rare thing in this household. So, it's such an important area, isn't it? And actually, now we're getting that sorted. It's made a huge impact on our family, which is why we're so pleased that you come to talk to us today, because I think it's such an important area for our children and young people, because it's so easily missed and it's so easily misdiagnosed, and it's not looked at enough, and I don't think with enough seriousness of the impact that it can have on them for the rest of their lives. We're not talking about short-term impact, long-term impact of supporting our guys to have as good a sleep as possible. I think is so important. So thank you so much for taking on that flag and going and doing that further research. From us as a community, it's such an important piece of work that you're doing. So thank you. But what I wanted to really talk about is, why is sleep such a common area of difficulty for children with learning difficulties, and particularly those with Down syndrome?
Well, I completely agree with everything you just said, Jo, about this kind of thing, that sleep impacts everything. And I'm sure we'll kind of cover it over the next kind of few moments anyway. But short-term, long-term, health, education, everything, sleep is so vital. And I often get quite frustrated at the lack of education that is provided around sleep. It shouldn't be caregivers who are at their wits' ends, who are like finally able to get that kind of golden appointment to then cover like 150 different things, and sleep is one of those. So I definitely think sleep is something that we need a lot more education around and teaching and people yelling about. So I'm very happy to be here and do my portion of the yelling. But I think when it comes to the prevalence of sleep problems, it's really quite kind of shockingly high. So if you look at children with neurodevelopmental conditions in general, you'll find about 80% have some form of a sleep problem. So hugely high, particularly when you're comparing to the general population, which is kind of neurotypical children. You're looking at up to 40%, much more kind of near 10, 15, depending on how you're measuring it. And that's one of the problems as well, as like how we measure sleep. So that's obviously from the researcher side of it. That's something I spend a lot of time thinking about. But we think that that kind of prevalence, that kind of 80%, is actually a bit too low, because so much of the time the way that we assess sleep problems isn't accessible. It's something that requires people sleeping in different environments with cables attached to them. It's not accessible. And also it's a taboo. People don't talk about the problems that their children are having in sleep beyond kind of 3 or 4, because it's seen as something that, oh, your child should be able to sleep through the night. And the fact that they can't, there's a lot of kind of parental guilt put onto caregivers. So people just don't talk about it. So yes, the prevalence rate is 80%. It's probably slightly higher than that. So it's a massive problem. And it ranges from neurodevelopmental condition to neurodevelopmental condition about what the sleep problem is. And that is another problem with trying to look at sleep. And so we kind of think one of the many reasons that kind of sleep is such a big problem is these kind of sensory processing differences and kind of differences both internally and externally, which is the way in which children with neurodevelopmental conditions are slightly different to their neurotypical peers. And so if you think about a child that's got a particular sensory profile, things like a dark room might not be nice. The weight of a duvet, the feel of the texture of pajamas, that kind of environment, it's not conducive to sleep because they're not happy in it. So you've got that. You've got, particularly if you're thinking within Down syndrome, you've got obstructive sleep apnea, which I think we'll be covering probably quite a lot today. But there are biological kind of differences in children with Down syndrome that causes that likelihood of getting obstructive sleep apnea. Whereas in other syndromes, so for example, there's a rare genetic syndrome called Smith-Magenis syndrome, SMS, and they've got an advanced circadian rhythm. So they produce melatonin, they are more tired in the middle of the day. And so because of the biology of their rare genetic syndrome, their sleep looks completely different to someone who may have ADHD or is autistic. And then you can kind of get into even more. I mean, there are so many different reasons. Pain, we think, is quite a big one as well. So if you are in pain, and that is either you may be able to communicate that, you may not be able to. But if you are in pain, sleep is not going to be happening. It may be disrupting your ability to kind of maintain sleep overnight. It may be causing waking. And kind of in line with that, you've also got different melatonin levels. So melatonin is our like sleepy hormone. It's the thing that clues us up to the fact it's time to be thinking of going to bed. And there are a few studies showing that autistic children produce lower levels of melatonin biologically. And so there is less of that internal need and drive to sleep because we're just not producing as much sleepy hormone. And I think one of the key things as well that really can't go missed is that kind of co-occurring psychiatric conditions. So we know that within neurodevelopmental conditions, again, around 80% will experience some form of psychiatric condition. So whether that's anxiety, whether that's depression, whether it's kind of low mood, increased stress. And we know that independently, these conditions have problems with sleep. So when you've got someone who, because of their neurodevelopmental condition, is likely to experience poor sleep, combined with the fact they're likely to have a psychiatric disorder, and psychiatric disorders are likely to have sleep problems, you've got this kind of vicious cycle where a child's likelihood of having a poor sleep is really high. So it's quite a long-winded answer to your question of like, who knows? There are so many different causes for poor sleep. And I think that's part of the problem, is that when you're saying, oh, you know, my child's just not sleeping, it can be really hard to investigate why and what the cause is, and from that, how to then treat it.
Yeah, it's such a complex area, isn't it? It's so interesting hearing all those statistics. Like, we know, particularly our community, that there's a lot of sleep issues out there, but to hearing that actually it's such a high issue, and it's like you said, that real kind of vicious cycle. For us, there's a lot of things going on around obstructive sleep apnea, which we'll talk about a bit more later. But actually, things like temperature regulation for our community is really quite poor often. So I spent a lot of my life desperately trying to fight like woolly socks off my daughter in the height of summer when everyone else is like refusing to put a bed sheet on. We're like, no, you can't wear that hat. So you cannot wear a woolly hat in bed tonight, even though you want to, because that's how she sensually wants to sleep, but doesn't really understand that she's going to get too hot. And things like the kind of chronic constipation as well in our community that so many of them suffer with, then often that interrupts your nighttime, because that's when it starts to get really painful, and that's when you have your issues. There's such a complex kind of area of things, isn't it, kind of impacting on it, from whether that be people's temperature regulation or their constipation, or such a huge range of things going on for our community that it really impacts. And that kind of brings me on to my next question, really, is I think it's, like you've just made us all aware, hugely underestimated, like the impact of and what is the impact of that on our children, young people. Because I think if you're the parent and care of that person who looks after that child, you are probably very tired by the time you've got up as well. They're tired. So at least you're both, you're dealing with the fact that you're then having to manage potential behavior or potential difficulties because of that tiredness. And you've also got less kind of tolerance for it because you're tired. But actually, those children are then kind of going off into school or going off into whatever setting they're in. And frankly, we're just trying to kind of not lose our minds in the day and maybe try and have a cheeky nap if we can to try and make up for it. But actually, those children, young people, don't get that opportunity. They're going straight off into another setting that has completely different expectations of them. So kind of what role do you think does sleep play in kind of learning behavior and kind of daily function for these children?
The short answer is massive. The problem is that sleep, if you think of any area in the way in which we access life, sleep will have an impact on it. So whether that is mental health, whether that's physical health, whether that's growth, whether that's behavior, whether that's food, whether everything is at some point linked to sleep, which again means that when you are kind of looking at communities that have such a high rate of poor sleep, everything is exacerbated. So if we think kind of particularly about physical and mental health, poor sleep kind of just dismantles everything. Anything that you've got in place, poor sleep just kind of bulldozes it. And so if you think overnight, we have time to rest, and we think sleep is this kind of weird time where you're in a dark room with your eyes shut for basically as long as you can. But actually for your body and your brain in particular, it's hugely active. So we do a lot overnight. We're just kind of slightly unaware of it. So one of the things we do a lot is kind of grow, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but our kind of muscles and our hormones get a lot of time to focus and repair and grow. So you'll often find that actually stunted growth, so children that are a little bit short compared to their kind of age range, often there's an underlying sleep problem. And also if you've got kind of a lot of activity happening in the day, we need sleep to recover. So I always use kind of Mo Farah as a bit of an example of this, kind of like international superstar when it comes to running. And his training, not only does it encompass when he's on the track and what he eats, but he also has a really fixed sleep schedule. And it's this idea of he basically runs, eats, sleeps, and then repeats. And it's because sleep does so much for our bodies in terms of recovery. So when we don't get that sleep, our physical health isn't as good. We're not as good at fighting kind of colds and flus. Our immune system's not as strong. We don't grow. All of these things. We wake up and we don't have as good a regulation when it comes to our food. We tend to eat what could be classed as kind of unhealthier foods because they've got short-acting sugar just to kind of keep the energy going, as we've all experienced. You have a poor night of sleep, you start the coffee and the sugar. They are what you need. But it's all of that. But then when we think about accessing school and kind of whatever learning environment that is, and that might not be your kind of traditional educational setting, but every single day we access learning, whether that's the route in which we take to get somewhere, somebody's name, the kind of the food that we've decided we do or don't like. All of these things are learning. And actually, when we don't have good sleep, our ability to learn is severely compromised. So I tend to think of the brain as a bit of a sponge. And during the day, you put your sponge into a bowl of water of everything that you could possibly experience and learn in that day. And overnight, we consolidate all of this, and some of it goes into kind of long-term memory. Some of it just gets sent away. We're just like, that's not a helpful piece of information to keep. And we literally squeeze this sponge dry overnight. And so the next day, we can put it back into that kind of new bowl of water, and we can experience a whole new day and learn a whole new range of things. But if we haven't had that sleep, then the sponge is already quite full of water. And so it's kind of a little bit of a strange analogy, but it's this idea that actually overnight, that is when we do our learning. That is when we learn our skills and we consolidate our skills. And so it's so much harder to then go into learning and learn even more when our brain's just trying to keep up from the day before. And that's just kind of mental health in terms of accessing education. Mental health, we've already kind of touched on the fact that there's quite a high percentage kind of co-occurring of poor health and poor mental health and poor sleep. But we know that kind of bouts of depression predict how long insomnia is going to last for, and vice versa. So we know that if you're not getting enough sleep, you're likely to be experiencing poor mental health. We also kind of know that when it comes to behavior, if you don't sleep particularly well, you've mentioned you're a little bit irritable the next day. It's harder to get through things. But when you've already got a child who may have differences in their communication style, they may be going into environments that societally aren't built for them because we've got a very neurotypical society, it's already so much harder to access education, to access the things that you need in life. And then when you put poor sleep into the mix, it's like emotion regulation goes out the window. You're much more irritable, you're much more impulsive, you're much more hyperactive. And it's like, how can you begin to kind of tolerate your normal environment that's already not great with all of these external factors put in? So it's really hard, and it does impact everything. And that's one of the reasons that I kind of want to shout about it, is this idea that actually there's a lot of support put in. People will have educational healthcare plans so they can access school. There are lots of things put in place kind of after school to support access to all sorts of things. But come, 6 p.m., support goes out the window. Caregivers don't get anything until the next morning. And if you're dealing with poor sleep, caregivers rightfully do whatever they can to get their child to sleep, whether that's co-sleeping, whether that's kind of regular nighttime wakings, all sorts of different things, because that is what gets maximum sleep for their child and everyone around them. So yes, we know that it's huge in terms of its impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can totally identify with that. And, if everyone in the household is feeling tired, it is a really, really difficult thing. I think it can be hugely underestimated. And, we will email in sometimes to school, so just so she's had a bad night, etc. But I don't think necessarily they will understand that when we've said she's had a bad night, what that actually means, because every night for her is a bad night, but we don't tell everyone every night that it's a bad night, because that's just her normal and that's our normal, and we've done it for 16 years and it is normal to us. And some people may not even have other siblings to recognize that that's not normal.
Yeah.
And actually they may just think that's what sleep is like for them, and they might not have really kind of considered it as such an issue. And it's like a lot of things, when we'll be filling out forms where you have to talk about your child's disability, sometimes you don't put things in because you're just so used to doing them that they don't seem like they're different to how someone might be dealing with a typical child, which kind of makes us then think about, like, what are the key signs that a child might be experiencing disrupted or poor sleep?
That's a really good question. And I think part of the problem is often the signs of poor sleep can look like something else. But I would say one of the key signs is daytime sleepiness. So if your child, particularly if you're not co-sleeping with them and they don't disturb you overnight, if your child seems to have real difficulty waking in the morning, seems quite slow and tired during the day, they're yawning quite a lot, they're struggling to kind of access education, and there's a marked difference to how you would experience them normally. Like typically for them, if there is a sudden change, it's like, oh, actually they're really struggling during the day, there's a lot of daytime sleepiness, that is quite good for indicating overnight problems, particularly again if you're not co-sleeping, because it may be that your child is awake, but if they don't feel they need to disturb you, or they're quite comfortable, they're just lying awake, caregivers can sometimes think, oh, they're getting quite a lot of hours, they're in their bed for X amount of time, they should be fine. And actually it may be that they are awake and it's unknown and all these things. So I think if you're kind of looking at a child and thinking you're really tired today, you're yawning, your eyes are a bit red, you might be kind of drifting in and out of sleep if a class is particularly dull, that I would say is quite a good indicator that someone's not getting enough sleep. And I think also it's a lot of the time it's like changes in behavior. So we know that sleep kind of increases impulsivity and hyperactivity. We also know that within quite a lot of neurodevelopmental conditions, these are traits in of themselves. So if you think about ADHD, for example, impulsivity and hyperactivity, it's kind of part of the course. But if you see a change in your child that doesn't align with how they are typically, and you're thinking, right, no, actually they are more impulsive than they typically are, or there's a lot more hyperactivity going on, that again is an indicator that they're not accessing enough sleep, that they're struggling to get their resources internally together. They've got that kind of lower threshold for emotion regulation. If their kind of behaviors changed again from what is typical. And I think that's something that is very unique to each individual. So I think there are a lot of things out there on the internet that say children of this age should be getting this amount of sleep and this should be having that. And there are a lot of broad sweeping statements. And a lot of the time they are accurate within a range. And so I think it's important to not go, well, my child is getting completely different sleep to someone else. That again is indicative of poor sleep. But if that's typical for them and they aren't tired during the day and they are accessing education and everything seems kind of fine, they may just need different levels of sleep, and that's okay. It's when you start seeing changes in their behavior, changes in their daytime sleepiness. And I think also a really key sign is that bedtime resistance. So if at the time in which you're thinking, right, we're heading off to bed, it's time for a bath, or it's time to put your pajamas on, or whatever the kind of pre-sleep stages are for your children, if there's a kind of resistance, if that's when the tempers are starting, if that's when the behaviors are exhibiting, like your child's exhibiting behaviors that are maybe saying, I'm not going up those stairs, I'm not doing this, that could indicate that there's some sort of distress around bedtime and sleep. It could be that they are having night terrors and they don't want to fall asleep because they're scared of it. Could be that they're scared of the dark. I mean, there are lots of different reasons for bedtime resistance, but I think it's sounds strange to say, it's a good sign that someone's got sleep problems if they don't want to go to bed.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm smiling because a lot of that kind of very much mirrors our experience. There's World War IV off in our house, try and get to bed, but then also to get out of bed is also, a whole new level of horror, kind of getting her out of bed. But ironically, actually, once she goes to bed, she's asleep within 30 seconds of being in bed. But then we knew when she was younger, how we knew that there were issues was actually not because she was necessarily coming to wake us up that much. She was quite a lot, but not that much. But you kind of go back in the morning into her room in the morning and you find that there was a new Lego tower had been built. Yes. Or a den was quietly in the corner of the room, or all those things, that not just kind of waking up and then being, where my boys might come into me, I'm awake, they're still a bit sleepy, and you can kind of settle and say, right, go back to bed. Clearly there had been hours of play-based things going on in that room beforehand, and it's taken a very, very long time to kind of get to why that is. But are there any kind of specific signs or symptoms that often get missed, or even can actually get mistaken for something else? Is that often something that happens, particularly with our non-verbal or those limited communication?
Absolutely. And I think, again, that's one of the big problems around sleep. I mean, you've got the kind of the same idea of bedtime resistance. So yes, it might be a very obvious sign. It may also feel like, wow, my child just wants to keep playing. My child just wants this. It might not be linked to poor sleep, but more linked to desire to stay awake. So I think that's quite a good one. I think also that idea of sluggishness and daytime sleepiness, because again, if you've got a child who is pre-verbal, limited verbal communication, they may not be able to say, oh, I'm tired. And it might be actually, okay, well, we're seeing some red eyes, we're seeing some yawns, but it's nothing extreme, it's nothing big. They're just seen kind of societally as being a little bit kind of lazy, not kind of that motivated. And I think that can be a real problem, because that actually, that could just be daytime sleepiness because they're not getting enough sleep overnight. We've also mentioned, again, that idea of irritability and hyperactivity and impulsivity. So all of these things that we've kind of already mentioned as signs that show can also be misunderstood. Poor mental health is another great example. And I think one of the reasons that these are often missed or mistaken for something else is actually because we view these kind of traits, as you were, as part of a syndrome or a neurodevelopmental condition. So it's really easy to say, oh, my child has ADHD, so they are just impulsive. It's really easy to say, oh, my child has Down syndrome, so they struggle to get up in the mornings. And I think a lot of the time, these sleep problems are just viewed as part of a syndrome, part of a neurodevelopmental condition. And it's not necessarily that they are. It might be, so for example, in Down syndrome, we know that there is a higher percentage of obstructive sleep apnea. So that is something that is quite syndrome specific, but it can sometimes mean that other things are missed because it's assumed it's OSA. And so it's that kind of idea of actually, if you're saying, yeah, okay, I am seeing these traits and I'm seeing these signs that are often seen in this neurodevelopmental condition or this syndrome, it's worth still keeping an eye out or asking people about them, because it could always be indicative of poor sleep. And I think because sleep impacts everything, there is always a reason to ask, and there's always a reason to kind of delve a little bit deeper into something, because it could be poor sleep and not their neurodevelopmental condition.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I get so frustrated by the kind of normalization of poor sleep for our communities, because like you said, they'll say, well, it's because it's part of their condition, or it's part of their disorder, or it's part of whatever it is, or their syndrome. And actually, if you have got things like obstructive sleep apnea, yes, it might be because of, but it's treatable, and therefore they shouldn't have to live with it. And if they're a typically developing child, they wouldn't be expected to live with it. But if it's our children who have like you said, quite a lot of the other ones, there are biological difference and biological changes, and whether there may be kind of treatments and things and support that we can do to give them, why should we be almost insisting just because they have a learning difficulty, they should live with it? It's just part of what it is. It doesn't matter that much. And actually, we know it makes massive impacts. And for our family, it shows up as we kind of like, we call it PMT because that's what it shows up like PMT. It's that kind of real hormonal, angry push against the world that can be really disruptive to her and very upsetting to her as well. And she will swing from kind of clinging to people, crying and sleepy, to actually ragey and not really know what to do with herself. And actually what we found is once we kind of got on top of the sleep better, that really changed, and the impact on lives is massive. So I think it's so important, isn't it, to challenge those people. But unfortunately it is, and I'm going to say this, and sorry if you are professionals listening to this, that it is often coming from a professional world, the normalization. Actually, it's often the parents and carers going in saying, I need help, and them going, well, it's just part of the course. You just kind of, they're all like that. And is that real frustration, isn't it? So what are some of these kind of more common disorders or issues with sleep that we see with our guys?
So often there's kind of difficulties with that initial sleep. So that first time you're trying to access sleep in the night, it might be that you've got that caregiver presence, it might be that you've got music on, all of these things. But if you've got difficulty and you need those external factors for your initial sleep, you'll need that overnight as well. So if you've got nocturnal wakings, then you'll need the same things in place to fall asleep again, which is often why caregivers get disrupted so much overnight. And then another kind of quite common sleep problem is regular nocturnal waking. So this idea of sleep maintenance and not being able to fall asleep and stay asleep for that period of 7 or 8 or whatever hours. So it's this idea of actually you're regularly waking up to the point that you are getting out of bed or just kind of going and getting a caregiver or going to the bathroom. And we all wake during nights because we have sleep cycles, we have periods in which biologically we briefly wake up to check our surroundings, to check our bodies. But if we're not pulled into a full awakening, at that point we fall asleep. So a lot of the time we don't know how many times we've woken up overnight. But what we see in children with kind of learning difficulties is this idea that actually they don't just fall back asleep. And there are problems in that. So you're then seeing a lot of kind of regular waking overnight. And that kind of overall, that combination of difficulty falling asleep and difficulty maintaining sleep, we then get, shockingly, problems with sleep duration. So the amount of sleep that a child is getting overnight tends to be much shorter because they're just not actually asleep for the amount of time they're in bed. So it might be that they are kind of trying to access sleep for 8 or 9 hours, but they're only actually asleep for more like 5. And so you've got that sleep duration, that overall sleep time is much shorter. And I think we'll go back to that kind of classic that we've mentioned quite a lot, is daytime sleepiness. So this idea of like, well, you're in your room and you appear to be asleep for enough hours, and yet during the day you still seem to be quite tired. So that is quite a common sleep disorder in terms of not only is the sleep you're getting maybe not good enough, deep enough, is there a reason that you're tired during the day, but also it's often a sign that there are nocturnal wakings happening or a delay in sleep onset, but a caregiver isn't aware because they aren't required in that moment. Yeah, so quite a lot.
Yeah, so much going on, isn't there? So we've been talking a little bit about a big range of people with different needs, but really thinking about those with Down syndrome because it's such a specific kind of issue for that community around obstructive sleep apnea. Why? Why is it such an issue for them?
Yeah, so there is about 50 to 80% of people with Down syndrome will have obstructive sleep apnea. So it's very specific to the syndrome in terms of if you're looking across neurodevelopmental conditions, OSA, UC, and Down syndrome. And a lot of this is to do with kind of differences biologically and physically. So it's quite a fancy word, craniofacial differences. But what we see in people with Down syndrome is kind of smaller nasal space. So their noses kind of internally seem to be a little bit smaller with narrower airways, which just means it's easier for them to get blocked overnight. If you've got smaller tubes, they're going to block more easily. And then you've also got kind of low muscle tone, which is something that I don't necessarily think is spoken about that much. But this idea of actually during sleep in general, our muscles relax. We kind of relax, everything just settles. We're not tight when we sleep. But if kind of you've already got low muscle tone and then your muscles relax even more, which is what we see in Down syndrome, the airway is more likely to collapse, which is a very kind of scary way of saying that your airways close. And again, because they're already a little bit smaller, you're restricting that ability to get air in and out. And then what the final thing that we often see in Down syndrome as well is this kind of enlarged tonsils and adenoids. So this idea that's often something that is kind of first line treatment. But again, if you've got kind of enlarged tonsils and adenoids and you've got a reduced air space, kind of tubes and all sorts, together, again, you're just restricting the amount of air that is able to pass. And so overnight, what this can look like in terms of impact is you get something called sleep fragmentation. And this is a little bit different to nocturnal waking. So nocturnal waking is the kind of prolonged periods of being awake overnight, And when I say prolonged, I mean kind of anywhere from like 5 minutes to an hour, if not longer, depending on your child. But the difficulties in falling asleep for that tend to be much more kind of behavioral, trying to get the environment right. Whereas sleep fragmentation is something that we do specifically see in children with Down syndrome who do have OSA. And it's this idea that your brain is built to make sure you are getting enough oxygen. It's like its number one job. And so when these airways collapse overnight and there's restriction in the amount of oxygen that is kind of reaching the brain naturally panics and forces awakening. But because it's in the middle of the night and because there's no obvious reason why you've woken up, a lot of the time it's a very short awakening. It's kind of awake, take some deep breaths and fall back asleep. And it's not that kind of full awakening. It's not a conscious awakening. And so it's called sleep fragmentation because it's this idea that you're not having prolonged wakings, but you're not having prolonged sleep because your sleep is constantly being disrupted with your brain's kind of survival instinct of I need oxygen, which is why you then see daytime sleepiness, particularly in Down syndrome, because at no point have you maybe got enough deep sleep. Your sleep cycle has been very disrupted. So you've been asleep for enough hours. You haven't had nocturnal wakings, but you haven't had good sleep because of this fragmentation. So you're tired the next day. And this kind of impact of sleep fragmentation and this kind of reduced oxygen overnight can have difficulty, like can have a real impact on memory, on cognition, on behavior, on mental health. All of these things that sleep already impacts is already intensified. So it's this idea of like you're not able to get sleep because your brain is doing what it has to make sure your oxygen levels are good enough.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is kind of where we want to jump in and kind of say, like Miriam and I are both, we're not medical doctors, so, and actually some of that can sound quite scary, but
yes,
and what we're trying to say, we're not trying to scare people, but actually, it is important they get the right support, the right help. They reach out to the medical profession to get that. And it's really interesting hearing you say all that because, it's something I'm really quite passionate about that our family have been through because my daughter has such significant issues with it. And we would asking medical professionals about it for years. For nearly 10 years, we did, some kind of mediums. We did amount of time to do sleep studies, but not full sleep studies. So there were just local hospitals with a SATS probe on her finger. And, none of us slept all night because their SATS dropped, but it was never quite enough. And it never hit a threshold. And it wasn't this and it wasn't that. And very much that same thing that we would see. We could even see it in the car. She'd fall asleep in the car and you can see it. You can see her go, and then she'll wake herself up enough, but then immediately back into big deep sleep, which is then why it's so difficult to get her up in the morning because she's so used to those kind of micro wake ups that she's like, no, it's not a real one. I don't have to come round here, and it becomes a real issue. So obviously we've been doing this journey for 16 years, and for the last, only really been treated for the last 2 or 3 years. So what should people be doing if they're concerned about their children's sleep?
So I think the number one thing, which is really hard, is get and talk to a medical professional. Go to a GP, go to a pediatrician. Any medical person that you have access to is someone you need to be badgering. And it's so hard because there are always so many things to talk about. And appointments are like gold dust and they're often too short. And everyone is overwhelmed kind of within the medical field anyway. But particularly if you're worried about OSA, it's just knocking on that door and keeping that conversation going, asking for sleep assessments, asking for this, asking for that. And it's so unfair that the onus is on caregivers, and it shouldn't be like that. And actually it should be, I think I read somewhere that kind of in America, the American Sleep Association's recommendation is that every child with Down syndrome should have a sleep assessment by the time they're 4. So we know there's a high prevalence rates of OSA. We know it's something that needs medical intervention. And yet, just like you've had that experience, it's so hard to get. But I think also if you think I've got sleep problems, but it maybe isn't OSA, or we're already being treated for OSA, it might be something else. There are charities that provide quite a lot of good sleep support. So Cerebra is a charity that people may have heard of. It works kind of nationwide. It looks at kind of supporting children with a range of brain conditions and neurodevelopmental conditions. They've got a sleep support system. They've got sleep practitioners. So it's sometimes getting a little bit creative as well with where that sleep advice is coming from. And they have a freely accessible sleep guide. So do just kind of like go and have a read of it. Because again, it's if you think there might be a problem and you maybe have got to wait a little while to see a medical professional and it may or may not be OSA, there are other things that you can kind of put in place to kind of try and see the difference. But the first line of call, if possible, should always be a medical professional.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are developing, because the Down syndrome medical interest group have developed guidance around this as well. And I think what we'll do is we'll put some stuff in the notes. If you're watching this on YouTube, it's in the notes on Spotify, just will come over to us and we can always give you the links. Actually to that information, that advice, because sometimes taking it with you, I think, is often very helpful if you've got that bit of paper or that you can wave at someone. And that's not saying there's millions of some really great professionals out there that will take you very seriously and will take you down the right avenue straight away. Unfortunately, that's not always the case, and you may have to be someone that says, you know what, I really want this investigated. I really want you to look at this. It's really important. And that's coming from someone that, we felt we had done that, but maybe we hadn't done it enough. She had other medical issues at the time. It was kind of one of those ones that we really must sort her sleep out. And 10 years later, they realised how severe her sleep apnea was, and and the severity of it, she would be on the top end. She's using BiPAP now rather than CPAP, which because she needs such high levels of support overnight. And for us, and actually we've seen huge jumps in things that were really important to her speech. We had massive improvement in her speech, and we didn't do anything differently except for treat her sleep issues, massive in terms of speech, massive in terms of confidence and her ability to kind of just manage herself during the day. And so there are some real kind of impacts that families and caregivers, so it's worth going, it's worth taking that information with you and worth kind of pushing through. But if you have then got there and you've got to that medical appointment, you've gone through and they've sent you off for sleep studies or interventions, what might they look like?
Yeah, so I mean, there are lots of different sleep assessments out there of varying different kind of output usefulness. So we have something in kind of research that we describe as the gold standard, which is something called polysomnography. And the reason that polysomnography is gold standard is because it's the only type of sleep assessment that looks at the brain while you sleep. So when we sleep, we go through 3 different stages that are categorized as non-rapid eye movement sleep, and then a 4th stage, which is categorized as rapid eye movement sleep. And your eyes move quite rapidly during rapid eye movement sleep. I mean, you couldn't guess it. Yeah, I know, it's wild. But this kind of sleep architecture and this sleep staging is only possible through polysomnography, because you have cables attached to your brains that are looking at different kind of different areas of your brain. But polysomnography often happens in a sleep lab, in a hospital, because you are connected to so many different wires. So polysomnography will look at airway and airflow. It will look at your oxygen levels. It will look at your heart rate. It will look at your brain waves. It will look at your eye movement. It will look at your chest movements. It will look at your snoring. It will look at your limb movements. It's insane. But as a result, it's not always that accessible, because you've got children who having to sleep in a novel environment is already going to be hard enough, let alone if they've got any sensory processing, any sensory differences. You are covered in wires and measures, and you've got things beeping, and it's not conducive to a good night's sleep. So whilst it's the gold standard, it's often something that actually isn't very accessible. But it's often used for kind of diagnosing obstructive sleep apnea, because it provides it's something called an AHI index. And basically all this means is it's the number of times your breathing pauses in an hour. And so the higher that index is, the more your breathing stops, the more severe your OSA is, which is why we use polysomnography, particularly within OSA, because we need that index. And there are like home sleep apnea testings, which are often called HSATs. And these kind of don't require somebody to sleep in a different environment. There are fewer cables and wires involved, but it's not that gold standard. It doesn't look at brain staging, and you're much more likely to look at kind of maybe oxygen and heart rate overnight. So it's limiting it, and it's much better if you've got children who just will not sleep in a sleep lab. It's much more accessible, but the information you get from it is much less. And then there are kind of questionnaires as well. So there's the pediatric sleep questionnaire, which is a screening questionnaire for obstructive sleep apnea, which should be kind of freely accessible online. You should be able to kind of get PDF versions if you're worried about it. Again, quite a useful thing to turn up to your doctors with if they're not listening to you. But that is to kind of caveat with, there are lots of questions that talk about snoring and breathing stopping overnight, which if you're a caregiver that isn't co-sleeping or sharing a sleeping environment with your child, it's going to be much harder to answer those accurately. So it's a good way to kind of start that assessment, but you're looking at more of that kind of sleep apnea home testing or polysomnography to really get that diagnosis of obstructive sleep apnea.
And we had quite a lot of experience of doing kind of the SATs based only, so they're just looking at oxygen overnight in local hospitals and things when she was younger, and she would always kind of scrape through those, and it wasn't until we actually got her in for the full gold standard testing, and actually, yes, her SATs dropped, and yes, her oxygen was dropping, but she was managing it okay for big chunks at night. Actually, what we were finding is her CO2 levels, so her carbon dioxide levels, were absolutely off the charts. So
Yes.
actually, sometimes it's not picking up those things that actually you might be getting enough oxygen into your blood, but actually are you getting rid of the carbon dioxide? So she was waking up every morning for the first kind of 10 years of her life with the biggest hangover she'd ever had. So, and that we know how when we've been out on a big night out the night before and you've got a rocking headache and you wake up and actually that some of our kids are managing and dealing with those types of things as well when they're getting up in the morning and the impact of that. So I think if people can kind of almost have that understanding, and particularly schools and teachers where they're coming in, actually you might have a first lesson of the day where they're just like, you know what, I don't want to do any of it, and actually you think, well, why is it always this lesson? And it might be they hate that lesson. It might be that you're not potentially putting things forward in a way that's appropriate for that child, or it might be they've still got a rocking headache that hasn't yet quite come off from that morning.
And I think it's also always important as well, like if you wake up for 10 years with a headache, that's not unusual for you. No part of you is going to think, oh, well, no one else talks about this headache, so maybe it's just me that's having it. It's actually no one else is talking about it because they don't get it. And that can be another challenge. It's like, exactly like you've said, is there something about that first lesson, or is it just because it's the first lesson? What are the telltale signs? How can we tell? Are they kind of shy of bright lights? Are they clutching their heads? There are subtle signs that can so easily be missed because for the individual, they don't realize it's something that other people don't experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of starting to finish off, can you walk us through some of the kind of interventions that, say they've gone through the process and they've developed there's some kind of sleep disorder, is there actually anything you can do about it, and what might they look like?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we're thinking specifically about sleep apnea, the first line of treatment is often to remove tonsils and adenoids to open up that space. So that's often like first line of treatment. If we can, let's get rid of them. And if that doesn't improve the sleep apnea, you then get that CPAP machine or the BiPAP machine that your daughter is on. And this idea is to basically it's keeping pressurized air through a mask that they sleep in overnight to just try and keep the levels of oxygen and CO2 kind of balanced overnight, and making sure they're not doing these kind of regular wakings and this like sleep fragmentation, and that they're accessing what they need to access in terms of oxygen overnight. But if we're kind of looking more across neurodevelopmental conditions, I'd say another quite common medical intervention is often melatonin. And it's this idea that kind of we produce it internally. It's a very naturally producing hormone. It's that sleepy hormone. But we can have exogenous melatonin, which you give kind of capsules, gummies, liquid, whatever. And it's this idea to kind of increase that internal level of melatonin so there's that more of that sleepiness. It's very useful if you've got children who are experiencing that sleep onset delay. So that difficulty in falling asleep is often where melatonin gets prescribed. I would say that it's a very spiky thing. So I did a project working with Cerebra, actually, that charity I mentioned earlier. And we were talking to caregivers, and one of the things we spoke a lot about was melatonin and this idea that it's quite spiky. So for some children, fantastic. For some children, doesn't work at all. For some children, sometimes it works. And so it can be quite frustrating if it feels like it's the last thing that could work, if it then doesn't work. But I think, again, it's that idea of making sure that the sleep problem that you're trying to treat is treatable with that intervention. It's not going to help if there isn't that difficulty in falling asleep. But then there are also non-medical interventions. So it's looking at sleep hygiene recommendations that I think all caregivers have heard in some form, and it can sometimes feel a little bit like parental blame of like, well, is your room dark enough? Is it cold enough? Is your child getting off screens? All of these things. But there is also evidence that if they are changed and they're slightly altered to work with your child, then they can still help. So having a bedtime routine, building those external associations of actually, we know that if we do these things and we end up in bed and you fall asleep, that will, if you do that the next night and the next night, you're building that association. Your body's learning that these things lead to sleep. So I think that's particularly helpful if there isn't a medical underlying cause, but it's much more behavioral. That's when these behavioral interventions can come in. If you've got a child that is co-sleeping and actually there is a desire from the family for the co-sleeping to maybe stop, that, again, behavioral interventions can go in. It's kind of gradually removing caregivers, doing everything kind of slowly, making sure that the child is still feeling secure and safe. But there are kind of medical interventions that work really well, and there are also non-medical interventions that work really well. There's always a range of support. It's just getting the right one and having it tailored to your situation and your child.
Yeah, it takes me back to the days where she was younger, where we did the kind of, she would fall asleep holding our hand, and then kind of like very slow. But then you'd be on the edge of the bed for almost weeks at a time sometimes, and then you'd be sat on the floor at the end of the bed for a week, and then you'd be sat a bit closer to the door. And unfortunately, it can take a huge amount of input from caregivers, but actually often it can be worth it in the end if it works out for you. And like you said, it's not about blame, is it? It's about understanding what each child needs and actually what each caregiver is in an emotional place to give. Sometimes actually, if you're not emotionally in a space where you feel like you can really target this as an issue, it might not be the time to target it. And actually maybe targeting how you are emotionally might be the first point, and then taking on that step, isn't it? And looking at it as a real kind of family side. So it's been so helpful. Thank you so much, Miriam. I could talk to you forever about this, but I think, realistically, time-wise, we have to be sensible. But if you could give one piece of advice to kind of a tired parent or a concerned teacher dealing with sleep challenges, like what would that be?
So I think my number one tip to tired parents is be kind to yourself. So as you beautifully just said, it takes so much effort to work on sleep problems. And I think a lot of the time we talk about tired child because obviously there are so many impacts of that. But if there's a tired child, there will be a tired caregiver, if not two, if not some tired siblings to throw in as well. It's not as kind of individual as some other problems that we see within kind of neurodevelopmental conditions and stuff. And so I think, parents are doing their best to maximize the sleep of the whole family. And often that comes at limiting their own. And I think, you hear that classic, you can't pour from an empty cup. But when it comes to improving sleep problems, it's going to come along with challenges. And often when you first start trying to improve sleep, you actually see a worsening of sleep, which is often, if I'm talking to caregivers and we're trying to change sleep, it's like, okay, maybe we should do this in a holiday when there's a time to like maybe lie in a little bit or have that additional nap. But it's like caregivers, it's okay to sometimes just go, I can't do this right now. And what we're doing is working, and it might not be picture perfect. It might not be what a sleep person would recommend, but it works for us. And it means that my child is able to access what they need to access. And it means that you are able to access work or your kind of day-to-day life. So I think be kind to yourself. You don't have to manage it by yourself. I spoke right at the beginning of that idea of like, there's this kind of assumption that sleep problems don't exist after 4 years old and people don't talk about it, but actually talk about it. There is support out there. A lot of people will be experiencing sleep problems. Build yourself an army and then go in and tackle it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. I totally agree. And I think the only thing I would add on to the end of that is if you are an employer of somebody who is a caregiver to a child with learning difficulties, like please be aware and just please, it might even just be checking in with people and saying, you're all right, or how can we help? Or, hopefully employers will also be as mindful to this.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, I think on that, it's like, if someone turns up drunk to work, you send them home. They do not do a day of work. But actually, we're okay turning up to work sleep deprived. And I think, we know it impacts our ability to work and concentrate. And if you are an employer and you're noticing that actually one of your employees just isn't quite managing their task load, have a break. Just kind of attack the day a little bit later so that you can focus on just getting in. But yeah.
Absolutely. Kindness is key, I think, is what we're all saying here. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Like we said, we'll put some links into the bottom of the podcast so you can check those out. But again, thanks so much for coming along today.
Not at all. Thank you for having me.